If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year, in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Catherine Kuiper. She is Assistant Professor of Education here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Kuiper, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Our theme today, our discussion on John Ruskin and the nature of the Gothic. And I'm certain there are listeners now who are saying, who's John Ruskin? We should address that question first. Who's John Ruskin?
Okay. So John Ruskin is most famously a Victorian British art critic and art historian. In fact, his lifespan pretty much exactly overlaps with Queen Victoria's. And he's an exemplar of Victorian prose in a number of ways. One is that he is very loquacious. He really goes for it once he gets going on a topic. And he's remarkably eloquent. He's an extremely expressive and effective writer. He's also remembered, though, not just for his style, which is impressive, but also for the breadth of his interest in topics. He not only writes copiously on art and architecture and history, but also on the natural sciences. He has entire essays on geology and ornithology, on myth, on literature, and on political economy. He actually has a very famous book that is a sustained critique of the Industrial Revolution and his thoughts on what a more just economy might look like. So he's quite a varied personage.
So we talk about today the nature of the Gothic. What's the significance of Ruskin's explanation of Gothic art and architecture?
So at least part of the significance is that before the 19th century and throughout part of the 19th century, especially in English society, there was a perception of Gothic art and architecture as lesser, as even in some extreme instances, people would regard it as barbaric, as a kind of what Europe degraded into after the fall of the Roman Empire. So there had been great examples of classical art and architecture, and then with the fall of the empire, there's this perception that everything basically was in shambles until the Renaissance, and we figured out how to do classical art and architecture once again. And Ruskin did some really important and inspiring work in explaining to his contemporaries what they were missing about Gothic art and architecture, that it wasn't simply an example of people forgetting how to build, forgetting how to carve, forgetting what people look like and how to make consistent and precise columns and arches. Instead, it's an example of something distinctly, he thinks, Christian and European that ought to be appreciated.
As we talk, so people can kind of have this in their mind, you have some examples of what we're talking about in terms of Gothic art and architecture.
Yeah. Most famously, I think people remember the cathedrals. The cathedral at Cologne in Germany, I think, is maybe the most typical example of Gothic architecture. But you could also think of Chartres in France, or even the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Those large monumental structures that are, for the most part, associated with cathedrals, although there are other examples of municipal buildings and other kinds of instances. But it is, I think, primarily associated with sacred architecture.
Mm-hmm. So how does his explanation of Gothic art and architecture and Gothic characteristics, how does it relate to what we are talking about here in terms of education?
Right. So this occurred to me first because as I was working through his essay on the nature of the Gothic, where he lays out what he regards to be the 6, what he calls moral elements of Gothic architecture, I was reflecting on the fact that the sort of education that we pursue and develop here at the college, we call classical education. And of course, that's an adjective that is associated with other types of things as well, periodization of music or periodization of art, to the point where we also can recognize things that we call neoclassical, and we can recognize those familiar elements. And I thought, well, when we're speaking of education, that word classical means something like time-tested. There's something permanent about it, although, of course, that's debated in different ways. But there's also there's an intentional reference to the classical world, to an inheritance that we've received from Rome and from Greece. And I thought, at first, as a sort of just thought experiment, what would it mean to have a Gothic education as opposed to a classical education? And this was just for fun at the moment. But then as I was looking through his 6 principles or 6 elements of Gothic art, I thought there really is something, I think, to this that might be a helpful addition to the way that we consider education in the classical ed movement. And so that's what led me to develop this idea.
So what do you think that he would think, what would Ruskin think about what we're doing with classical education?
So he did write on education specifically in a couple of instances. There's a book very interestingly titled Sesame and Lilies, where he actually goes into his thoughts specifically on education. But what I ended up writing about and speaking at the college was importing his principles that he lists in the essay on the Gothic. He calls the elements of Gothic savageness, changefulness, naturalism, the grotesque, rigidity, and redundancy. And taken just on the face of it, those are kind of strange and arresting words, and certainly not something you would want to associate with your education, right? I want my children to be savage and changeful. That doesn't sound very appealing. But the way he unpacks those terms, I think actually is really helpful for us as teachers and as developers of classical schools. So for instance, it's a very typical, I would say, feature or characteristic of classical schools that some value is placed on the rigor of the education. It is supposed to be a superior sort of education that will really prepare the child for further studies if that's what they want to pursue. And I think that while the rigor of an education is clearly a good, especially that parents want to pursue for their children, at the same time, I think the way that Ruskin talks about savageness as a comfort with imperfection. He says that one of the reasons Gothic architecture was considered barbaric is because there are kind of mistakes and variation and imperfections present in the work that you don't see in classical architecture. But his explanation of this is that in classical architecture, there is a type that's laid out by a master artisan, and then the workers who complete those columns, those arches, are in fact slaves who are following a specific pattern, and they don't actually have anything to put into of their own, right? They're not going to modify or interact with the pattern. They just need to repeat it. And so it's a matter of technique. Their own spirit is not really present in those works. And so Ruskin thinks it's actually a good thing or something to be admired in Gothic architecture, that the workers actually put themselves into the building, and in those imperfections we actually can see their presence in the building. And so I think regarding imperfection maybe with a new light, that it's not only inevitable, but there's something very human, right? About imperfection and allowing that to, if not change our desire for rigor, modify it somewhat, qualify it a little bit. Similarly, I thought that while we do need canonical texts, right? This is what our curriculum is centered around. We need a sort of stable structure to build our classes around. The way that he talks about changefulness, I think, is a good reminder that the desire for innovation is not an inherently bad desire, and in fact can actually be directed in some good ways. So those are some examples of the way I saw his description of the thought behind Gothic art as a helpful, let's say, conversation partner for classical schools.
And what about rigidity and redundancy? I think of the structure that we provide via classical education, the curriculum, the intentional decisions about what to teach and how the different subjects can work together in an education. And then redundancy, of course, we want to make sure that our students know things.
Yes.
And sometimes that is through repetition.
Yes, indeed. In fact, there are works, right, especially poems, you think about things that could be repeated easily, that are particularly beloved, and there's a delight in returning to them, a kind of abundance, life-giving quality in those particular works. And with rigidity, I think there's an additional interesting element here, because the way he describes rigidity is as a facet of the Northern European climate, actually, that produced this architecture. And so it almost seems like a response of a particular, right, there are architectural needs. There are certain things a building has to have in order to stand. But then Ruskin is exploring the ways in which, when that comes into contact with this particular place, it takes this different particular form. And that's part of the beauty of it. And so I think, that's maybe not something we would expect from a word like rigidity, but I do think there's a way in which it's a reminder that in addition to those canonical texts, right, we do depend on our Western and American heritage as a sort of, there's a pious fidelity to that heritage. But I think this can also remind us that in a country as big as America, with as many different regions, there are particularities to those different places that, right, the literature of the Northeast is not the same as the literature of the Southwest. And that's beautiful as well. And I think an element that would fit well with the project, I think, that we're undertaking.
If we take rigidity and redundancy to another level, that leads perhaps to memorization by doing things over and over. And we've talked on the show before here about, why do we memorize poems in the classroom? Why perhaps we memorize the preamble or the Declaration of Independence? Right. Does help provide some insight perhaps on why those things are important in a classical education?
I think so, because I think while in the case of memorization, there's a difference from what Ruskin is talking about in that he's talking about opportunities for variation and deviation, and especially with texts like the preamble and the Declaration, you want to remember word for word. This is exactly what it was. But I do think he describes rigidity as active stability, not just a stability of a kind of immobile lack of movement, but rather a kind of inhabiting a form in an active way. And I think what it suggests to me, at least, is a mode of teaching, so that you do repeat certain texts. And there are things that we want our students to have memorized. But I think there's a way in which we can inhabit those texts as teachers to show students that this is alive, right? This is living significance for you right now. And you're not simply repeating it in an automatic way, but in a vital and energetic way.
What else specifically do you think we want to draw out from Ruskin when it comes to lessons or observations or things to consider for our teachers inside the classical education world? So
one sort of funny thing is his discussion of the grotesque, which, you can think of gargoyles, right? Or the kind of exaggerated features of some arches where the people look a little strange or they're making odd faces, right? And one of his explanations of this is that this is an expression of the artist at play. So even in the case of sacred architecture, which is of the utmost seriousness, this is a building dedicated to reverent worship of God, there's also a sense of a spirit of play at work in the building itself. And I think this can be a really healthy and good thing to, again, I'm thinking from the perspective of the teacher. How do you run your classroom? Do you need a schedule and routine and structure? Absolutely, right? Otherwise, it's not going to work. But then informing that structure and that schedule, I think finding ways for a spirit of playfulness and what he calls jest, right? This is what it makes him think of when he looks at those structures. I think that's a good addition to the way that we think about classical education as well.
Dr. Catherine Kuiper is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College. We talk about John Ruskin and the nature of the Gothic. Dr. Kuiper, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
My pleasure.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. That's Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.